When we look at the net HTTP package, right, if we look at godoc.org, there's the net package. And the net package has all of our network stuff, like the TCP stuff. And in our code base, we have all of the samples of building up a TCP server for HTTP right there. And if you're watching this video online, just so that you don't feel totally lost, we are at GitHub goes to 11 Golang Web Dev. And so that's where you could find this code base. And so you can build an HTTP server up from the net package. I think I do better when it's recorded because it's like, okay, I got to make sense. Let me present something. But we could build a HTTP server. We could build a TCP server for HTTP from the net package using TCP. All right, because TCP is the network and HTTP is a protocol that gets sent over the TCP stuff. And so HTTP, right, is just a bunch of rules for how do we send stuff. What's it look like? What do our messages look like? So we have requests and responses, and those requests and responses are just a bunch of text, but they're texts that have to be in a certain order. So the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, comes up with RFCs, requests for comments, and the most current one for HTTP 1.1, which is now outdated, is RFC 7230. And if you look in there, you can see things like, you know, on my desktop here, where you have the browser, a client makes a request. That request, and you can't see this right here, has a request line, headers, and any payload. And then the response is the status line, headers, and any payload. The request line and the status line is just that first line of the text that's being sent. And that first line for the request line is going to be the method, which will be like get or post. And then the URI, Uniform Resource Identifier, which will be, you know, /about or whatever. And then the version, HTTP 1.1. And then the status line will be the version, HTTP 1.1, and then the status code, 200, and then a reason phrase, OK. Right? And then after that, we have all the headers, and then after that, we have our body or payload. So that's standard coming and going. That's HTTP, and that's all defined by RFC 7230, which is come up with by IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, which are the people who put together the standards and protocols. That sounded pretty good, huh? I like that. I learned a lot in a year. So, enough self-deprecation. So that's the net package, and we've been spending plenty of time in there. Now we're going to look at net HTTP, and this is a little bit of a tough nut to crack. And so if you go to Golang, like web, tutorial, right, whatever, writing web applications, their articles, wikis, they have a little web application, they'll walk you through this. But even this is a tough nut to crack. Like if you aren't familiar with Go, and we're going to try to take a crack at this tonight, and we'll put it all together. But first, I just want to make sure, and we've been here for a little bit in this class, I want to make sure we understand just kind of how everything works. Any questions so far? How many people, that's good review, raise your hand. Cool. How many people, you got a little bit of something new out of that? Cool. All right. So I've been thinking about what's the best entry point to understanding the net HTTP package and how it all works. And this is, I think, the best entry point. It's just the handler interface. And the reason it's the best entry point is because here you have the handler interface. So anything with this method is going to implement the handler interface. Any type with that method, because types have methods in Go, any type with that method implements the handler interface. So let me just give you an example of that. And so here we have under 017, understanding the net HTTP package. We have handler, and this code right here doesn't do anything. There's nothing going on in main, but I've declared a type, and the type that I've created is hot dog, and the underlying type is an int. Whoop-de-doo is kind of a little bit nuts, but you could create your own types in Go, right? And then I've attached a method to that type. And so that method which I've attached is the serve-HTTP method with this signature, a response writer and a pointer to a request, right? And so it's that method right there, response writer and a pointer to a request. And so now any value of this type, because values are of a certain type, any value of that type is now a handler. Why is that important? Because when we look at the built-in server, and if we looked at the code for the server, this is going to be a lot of the TCP stuff that we did. If we look at this built-in server, HTTP listen and serve, or TLS if you want, the HTTPS stuff. When we look at that built-in server, it asks for a handler. And so this is just an identifier. This could be any name, but this is the type. So it's going to be some value of this type that gets passed in as an argument. So it's asking for a handler, which is what this is. Okay? So if we created a variable var h hot dog, h is now a handler, and then if I did HTTP listen and serve, and I said :8080 is where we're going to listen to serve and pass in h, right? Then I could pass h in there because h is a handler. And so that's what the next file shows. So if you look here and open up the next file, there's where we did that. So I think that's the entry point, is just understanding that handler bit and that listen and serve takes a handler. And then if I ran this, this is what's going to print out to my response. I'm fprinting, and fprint writes, right? Takes a writer and some data. And so here's the writer, and you pass in a string, right? Fprint takes, unlimited types of data there, and it writes to the response any code. So if I ran that, you'd see this in the browser, right? Because listen and serve is going to serve this back. Okay, so there's the first part. So let me close all that. So the next thing, which is cool to understand, is like, well, here we have in handler a response writer and a request. Okay, and so let's look at that request. A request comes in. What is that request? So if we just go straight to GoDoc and we look at what type handler is, go to type handler, and type handler is that interface. There's a response writer and a request. Well, let's understand each of these. And so I got through mostly kind of getting everything down for request. So we'll go through it, and then we'll kind of do the same thing with response writer together. Okay? And so if we go and we look at request, it is a struct. And so request is a struct with a bunch of fields. Now there's a lot of comments in here, and a lot of fields like proto things that are at a higher, more advanced level, not as needed. So right here in our little README, I've said, well, here's this modified documentation. Here it is with most of the comments and some of the fields stripped out. Right? So we could just quickly see it. This is not type request. These are most of the fields. Not all of them. And most of the comments have been pulled out. So request has a method, so we could see the method. It has a URL, which is of type package URL, type URL, and it's a pointer to a URL, right? It has a header, which is of type header. It has a field body, which read closer. It has a field content length, host, form, and post form, which are URL values, multi-part form, and remote address. That's all pretty interesting stuff. So let's go through and look at some of those things. So here I have this request folder, and we have parse form. And so here's my hot dog, and it's an int. And then here is what makes it a handler. So that type is now a handler. So any value of type hot dog can be used where a handler is asked for, because handler is an interface that says anything with this method implements that interface, right? And so down here I say variable h is of type hot dog, and listen and serve, and I pass in h. Well, somewhere listen and serve is going to call serve HTTP, right? And so when it calls serve HTTP, it's going to run this code. What's that code going to do? It's going to take the request and it's going to parse form, and then it's going to create a variable, anonymous struct, right? So it's a struct with this field, and then I populate it with that data, and then I'm going to execute my template. And so I've done this here where I've created a variable template, and I've parsed it, and my template is this with templating stuff in it. But what I want to, so I'll walk you through that in a second. But what I want to show you are how do we get values back. That's really interesting. Like if somebody submitted values through a form, How do we get those back? Or if there are URL variables, how do we get those back and use them? The goal here is to understand, what is this request type? It's a struct, and there's fields in it. What are those fields, and how do we use them? Huh? And you put in the value, right? Yeah, so that's one way. So one of the things Gentry's pointing out, and we'll get to that in just a second, is request.formValue. Because the ones I have here are form and post form. And when you look at the comments, it said this field's only available after parse form is called. So let's go look just straight at the documentation. I'm going to do parse form so we can see that. But here, this is in the request struct. Everybody follow me? We're all fresh from work? Ready to do another 5 hours. Request, this is the request struct, and there's a field form and post form. What's the difference? So both of them say this field is only available after parse form is called. Okay, just file that to the side for a second. But form contains the parsed form data, sweet, so form has been submitted, including both the URL and the URL field's query parameters and the post or put form data. So this form has both the URL variables and also any form variables that got sent over. Okay? Because if you submit a form with the get method, it's going through the URL. Or you just might have URL variables you want to access, and you could use form to do that. Post form is only going to be the parsed form data from post patch or put body parameters. Body being the payload, it's only the form. There's no URL stuff in there. Okay? So let's take a look. And parse form, we have to call parse form. Why? I sound like Jim Makovsky. Anybody been in his classes? So here's the request, right? And then the request has all of these methods available to it, and parse form is one of those methods. And we just saw that if we want to use form or post form, we have to do parse form. So what's parse form? Parse form parses the raw query from the URL and updates our form. Our form in this case is the request, right? So they just used R instead of REQ. For post or put request, it also parses the request body as form and puts the results into both our post form and our form post, blah, blah, blah. So let's see it happen. So I'm going to go and run this, and we are in O3 and O1. Okay, so I have a form. My name is McLeod. And so I got back variable names, the identifiers and values. The variable name was fname, the value was McLeod. The variable name was submit button, the value was on the button. This is on the button. So what is that form that it's sending that back? And not everybody knows this, but that form has a form action, just go right to default, and the method is post, and the first input type is text, the second one is submit, and then the name becomes the name of the variable in which the value is stored when it gets sent back to the server. Because a lot of times you'll see this. And people just like, I don't know, I just do ID and name. ID is if you want to target that with CSS or JavaScript. Name is naming the variable in which the value that has been entered is sent to the server. So my variable is fname, right? Placeholder's first name, and autofocus, autocomplete off. And then my button, the name is submit button. So I just want to distinguish it from submit, so nobody would think that that's where the name came from. And the value is on the button. That's what's on the button. And so when I send this in, it showed, hey, you have a variable called fname. You had a variable submit button, and that's the value, and that's the value. Okay? So we were able to parse the form, and then once we parse the form, what happens when we parse the form? Like, how did I determine that this is this type, that submissions are this type? Submissions is just what I came up with, but how did I know that this is the type I need to send over? Because when I look at the request type, form and post form give me URL values. From package URL, type values. What are type values? Type values are a map with a string, key, and a slice of string values. Okay. So when I say form, I get this, because that's the type. Give me the request form. It gives me this type, and that type is this. Right? So I said, okay, I'm going to have a struct with a field submissions. And if I had done it like this up here, right, this is the way you guys have seen, and that's an anonymous struct. I'm not giving it a type. That's my phrase. I don't know if that's right. But if I created type data to pass struct, right, and then I said I'm going to have submissions, and that is a map string slice of string. Then down here, I could do, instead of that, I could see D colon equal data to pass, and then populate the fields and request dot form. Right? Because what is request dot form? What type is it? URL values, right? So underlying type. I could have also done it like this. If I passed in URL values, I might have to do some. I wonder if I could just do this. URL values. That makes a little bit more sense, doesn't it? It's a little bit more readable. Because then that corresponds to URL.values. That's what I end up passing in. That's the type. That's a little bit more readable. And so let's see if that still executes. Cool. I like that better. Good code cleanup. So what is the template doing there? I pass in data. Pass in data to the template. That data comes into here, and I say, hey, if submissions, because data is a struct, so if I have this submissions field, and that if statement goes all the way to here, okay? Let me bring this down. And so then I just print a paragraph, which is this paragraph right there. Print that paragraph. And then I have a key, and I range, so I could range over that because that's a map. And I could get the key and the value because this is URL values is a map, and it'll have a key and a value. The key will be a string, and the value will be these things. And remember, what's being stored here are the form values, or the data that's been sent to us. So the key is going to be that identifier, and then the values be whatever values are stored there. So we range over submissions, we get the key and the value, store those in variables, and then I print out the key, and then the value is a slice. So I range over the value, and I print out whatever's in there, and I end that range, and then I end the outer range, and then I end the if. Yeah? So I took it to the next step. One of the next things I did is I then added in the request method. And so to add in the request method, I have as part of my, and I think I should actually change these. So I'm going to just change, kind of flows a little bit better, I think, if it goes to the URL first. But then my README is a little bit off. But heck yeah, we'll just go with that. 3. And then we'll come back here and we'll do 2. So we'll do that first. And I'll get rid of that. And I'll get rid of that. And oops, I want that one. I don't want that. Get rid of that. There we go. I don't know. I kind of liked it the other way. There's an argument for that too. Let's leave this one. All right, so what's something else? We could also get from this struct the method, and that's a string. So that's going to be easy. So to get the method, all I have to do is in my struct, like just give it a field name. I called it method because that makes sense. And then from my request struct, I got the method. From the request struct, I got the form. All right, it's of this type, and that type needs to be URL.values. And so 02 request method was get. Yeah, this makes sense. The request method was post. Okay, so we're seeing that. And then the data that came back. And then in the third one, we could get the URL values. And so here are the URL, here's the documentation, right? And there's URL, and it's a package pointer to a type URL from package URL. And if we look at package URL, there are some, this is a struct, and there are some fields in it. It's a struct, and there are some fields in it. A lot of them are strings, right? So I want you to download the code base. Start with this file right there, and I want you to print out I want you to modify your index.go.html and your main.go to print out this. Okay, so as I change this, so I want everything that's a string in the request URL to be printed out in the template. You have 15 minutes.
Which one do we start in again?